Heavenly Father, open our hearts to the silent presence of the Spirit of your Son. Lead us into the mysterious silence where your love is revealed to all who call. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus. Okay, we're going to eavesdrop on a conversation. Guess it's not that private, is it, huh? Yeah. And we'll start off with just if you don't mind, I'll just read this quote and then ask for your comment. And the quote is, "The first part of the Christian journey is to realize that there is an other. The second part is to become the other. The third and greatest part is to realize that there is no other." That quote is from Thomas Keating. So, figured we'd start with a softball anyway. If you would, in the context of our theme, oneness, unity, and contemplation, if you'd maybe talk about that a little bit. Thank you.
No thanks. Well, that particular quotation comes at the end of a long discussion on oneness and the meaning of life in a movie called One that I happened to participate in with about 20 other people. So to offer it at the beginning is not appropriate. But since you have begun, I'd like to say that it really isn't a quote from me. I received it from another source, and since it's quite often quoted now, I think I should explain that this is the description of what a young friend of mine, an aspirant at the monastery in Snowmass, who is no longer with us but spent some useful time there, heard in a dream. So it comes from another realm. And the person who spoke it in his dream was the very well-known author and the founder of one of the Christian monasteries in India, an Englishman.
Bede? Father Bede?
Yeah, Father Bede Griffiths, shortly after his death. So it really, I can't guarantee that this is Father Bede's remarks, but as soon as I heard it, I was intrigued and entranced by it, and I think it is, if we look at it, a marvelous summary, very in the most general terms, but very accurate of what the spiritual journey is, and that, for one thing, it suggests that there are levels of relating to this mystery of oneness that are quite different, and one is more profound than another. So if the churches, for instance, or the religions only speak from the first level, there is another, recognizing there is another. This is really very fundamental. It means you finally realize there is a God, and maybe you ought to do something about it, and so on. And so it leads to your first conversion, so to speak. What do you do then? You then try to become the other. In Christian terminology, this would be called the imitation of Christ. So you Or if you're a Buddhist, you try to discover the Buddha nature by various means. In other words, the second stage is a place of means in which your original understanding there is this other is now made functional and practical by a life of pursuing oneness with this other, capital O, by the way. Now, if that goes on long enough, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, for some people, maybe 75. Whenever, at some point, and maybe that point is not appropriate till after death, because it is very unified. I mean, in other words, if I understand the mystics who've described this in different traditions, it's a totally non-dual view of reality, which doesn't take you out of the nitty-gritty of the infinite diversity of everyday life, but enables one to see in everyday life just one thing: all things in God and God in all things. So that as you folks are sitting there fairly solidly, you're not really there at all. in the sense that the greatest reality in each of us is not us, but not me, but that which is manifesting itself in each of us. And so in the Christian perspective, seems to me, but maybe Laurence can straighten me out here, but it seems to me that Christ is, virtue of the mystical body and the spirit, is saying in the gospel and in the literature of Paul that describes it, that right up front there in us is the mystery of Christ incarnating in us. Now, not in the strict sense in which we understand the incarnation in the terms of the Council of Chalcedon and so on, but in the very experiential sense in which we know that the real me is not the false self or the ego, either the low or high ego, or even the identity that I acknowledge, but a mysterious kind of super identity which is not visible, hidden from us in this life unless you penetrate all these levels of oneness, which is what we will experience fully in the kingdom, which is not an institution but a state of consciousness. And the consciousness is not just human, it's Christ's consciousness of the Father as Daddy, as Abba, as me. And so I was really blown away by that little formula, and I suspected it might well have come from Bede, because in his last years he has, maybe you saw the videotape, he was interviewed after he had a stroke in which the left side of his brain, I guess, was damaged, mostly. And remember, he was a brilliant intellectual, as they've come in England. Brilliant. And he said that released his anima. Everybody knows what the anima is. My understanding of Eckhart, the Beguines, and John of the Cross in many places is talking about this level. Well, at that level, are you still in this life? Yes. But you're in this life without, in the same way Christ was in this life, identifying with the human condition in all its imperfection, weakness, and the consequences in human freedom that is the very opposite of God at times. So it means that in God, the power of love triumphs over everything. And we don't understand that yet unless one has accessed a few moments of oneness in some form, like the Mysterium Tremendum at Fascinens. But when you sit down then in centering prayer, or in any discipline that leads directly or moves towards the apophatic contemplation, non-conceptual prayer or meditation, the place where self-reflection stops. So it's the self-forgetfulness in the sense of relating our psychological experiences during prayer to ourselves. So it's a place of the most exquisite freedom, at least while it goes on. And then apparently God must have wanted it this way. Life makes it as difficult as possible to hold on to that level of consciousness, just to drive it deeper and deeper by opposition, the way you hammer a nail into a board, bang, bang, bang. So that life itself, just as it is forcing a deeper and deeper grasp and approach of that. So this is why I think the Zen Buddhist at least can say that everything just as it is perfect. Not from a human perspective, but from the perspective of the transformative process and goal that God has entrusted to us and is living in us right in the midst of our difficulties, pains, aches, disappointments, and the colossal failures of society towards large parts of the human population. God is the deepest reality in everything that happens and is perhaps most present in what is most unpleasant in ourselves. So, would you care to...
To interrupt?
No.
No, sorry.
Continue or correct.
I'll continue. No, I was fascinated. I don't want to add anything. I don't think. Well, it reminded me, just maybe to be a bit more graphic at the moment. When you said it was Father Bede, it reminded me of two things. One was Father Bede seems to like to appear to people in dreams, because there was his great disciple, Father Christodas at Shantivanam, was a monk in another monastery and had a dream of his guru appearing, but didn't know who it was. And then when he met Father Bede, who came to the monastery to give a talk, recognized him as the guru that he'd seen in his dream. And and then he went and joined Father Bede and then set him free to teach and write, and it was the turning point, really. And the other, as you were talking about, these different levels that are simultaneous. I mean, that's the difficult thing for us to grasp, is that they are simultaneous, and that's the ever deeper paradox of the reconciliation of opposites. What the mind, anyway, I suppose, sees as opposite are completely coexistible and coexistent. I think that verse, though, I think Father Bede was probably quoting in the dream, because it's very similar to an Indian saying, which I can't remember exactly. It's something to the effect that the world is real, the world is unreal, and then the third verse says the world is real and unreal, something like that. But the other graphic story it reminded me of was when I was actually staying at Shantivanam, Father Bede's ashram and monastery once in India, and when I arrived very hot and bothered, I went for a shower in the very simple little shower. Not really a shower, it's just a tap. You just put water over yourself. And I noticed that the water in the little shower room was building up, wasn't running out of the hole that it should have been running out of. When I poked a stick through the hole, I hit something quite spongy and organic. And it turned out to be a little frog. And the frog came into the bathroom, and it stayed there. And I picked it up, and I took it to another universe. And but it found a portal to come back. And it was there. Every time I took a shower, it was there. And I gave up trying to get rid of it after a while. Actually, it brought its wife later, I think. And when I was, I got quite friendly with it. It was always there. And then as I was leaving, I looked to say goodbye to it, and it wasn't there. So, but then when I went to put my shoes in my bag, it was in my shoe. So I did say goodbye to it. It was a very difficult separation, but it happened. And the very first thing I read as I was on the train leaving was the symbolism of the frog in yogic symbolism, yogic philosophy. And the frog is a symbol of exactly this ability to coexist, to exist in different spheres at the same time. That's why it's an ideal of the yogic state of union, because it can live in water and live in the dry world. And also it can swallow its tongue unaided, which is a yogic trick, which human beings can't do unaided, but the frog can do on its own, apparently. So, anyway, that is an illustration, I think, of what you're saying.
Are you implying that I'm a frog? Well, here's the advantage of being nothing. It doesn't matter what people think you are or what you are. But I wanted to add a little nuance to Father Bede's last days. In his video, he says that after he had a stroke, which immobilized his great intellect, his right brain started to work, that is, associated with the anima, and which he described as the feminine side of his brain. So he said he made more progress in those last 2 years after his stroke than he had in all the rest of his life put together. Now this is not a special endorsement of women, but it's an endorsement of that which is feminine in everybody, and that women are supposed to exemplify in a great degree, I suppose, which is this intuitive side of... maybe you have some thoughts.
No, he said when he had that experience, he was sitting in his room, and it was as if somebody punched him in the side of the head, and he said it was as if the television screen went wobbly, and he couldn't... And then he thought he was dying. He thought, this is it. I better get prepared. So he got over to his bed and lay down on his bed, and then he heard a voice, or some articulation within him, saying, surrender to the mother. And I think when you look at his history and the way he describes his own psychological history, his personal history, one can see why that perhaps was such a powerful, correction within his psychic balance. And then he still thought he was going to die, but as he recovered, and it was very strange because his designated successor came from another part of India to see him, got off his motorbike, and dropped dead with a heart attack at the age of 44. And they came in to tell Father Bede, thinking that, well, this is going to be the end of him. And he jumped out of bed and said, well, I better take over. And he zoomed around the world for the next 2 or 3 years. What he said was immediately after the stroke, and this may be of interest to these three levels we were talking about, he had no resistance to the power of compassion, or empathy, perhaps is the word. And when somebody came to see him, and he felt they were suffering, or they told him some sad news, he would just break down in weeping. He just couldn't be other to them. I suppose that would be it. And so maybe, and then he said gradually this capacity to be other, which I suppose we do need in order to live in the material and psychological world, that was rebuilt, reformed to a certain degree, much less so than before. I mean, the people who knew him say that after the stroke and after he had got back to this working balance, that he was different. He was more tactile, you know. What? Tactile. I mean, he would be more open, people more affectionate and more un-English that way. And he was so it was as if there was a correction that had to take place in him, which actually had a providential aspect, because it gave him those 3 years, I think, of prophetic fervor. He was driven really by the Spirit during those years. So it seems as if we do need some veil or filter to keep the other from becoming completely one with ourselves. That's part of the process. But then eventually, I'm sure, as you say, that veil is totally removed.
I might just add, since we're in this discussion about those three levels in those generalized terms, whoever said it, or wherever its ultimate source was, I think it is quite profound. And it suggests also that intellectuals, men especially, have a hard time getting into contemplation because they're so bright, they think too much. And then they're educated to think even more. And the more degrees they get, the more opaque they can sometimes become. Not because that's necessarily the result of using the intellect, but it's not sufficiently integrated into what Jung calls the anima, that is the feminine side. So remember, in God there is no gender, and yet there are these two aspects of the divine, which is mother and father, or whatever other term would be suitable. And so human beings can't be both at once physiologically, at least not unless Mother Nature makes a mistake. But they need to be integrated, and so perhaps this is one of the challenges of human growth.